Hey, everybody, welcome to the Rooted Podcast. My name is Kevin Hu, and I also have Pastor Kevin Butcher on today. And Kevin, I want to just share a little bit, just to kind of provide some context for the conversation and have you just, as the expert, dive right into this particular topic. And this is partly a confession as well. I remember, especially in probably the end of 2020, so we were into the pandemic, sheltering in
hmm
place, tensions were high. I got into this groove for sure where I was just preaching a lot of truth just all the time, and so I would, yeah, and most of the folks who were around me, they would tell me like, man, that was a powerful sermon. You really brought God's word and all these things. Um, and I would look back at the sermons because some folks would be like, that was a really strong sermon. That was harsh, or that felt heavy to me, or, for certain reasons. And I would look at him like, what do you mean? It's purely biblical. It's a ton of good truth, right? There's no heresy in there at all. If anything, I kind of lighten the blows. But then I started hearing some kind of feedback from folks who really cared about me and who were also listening very intently. And I started getting comments, I think, around like, "Are you okay?" And part of it was like, why are you asking me those kinds of questions? And as I go back and as I reflect, I wonder now, like, I was very upset about a lot of things. I was hurt by a lot of things. I was angry about a lot of things. And so now, as I go back and now in hindsight, I look at that and I go, I wonder if I was preaching angry. And one person did ask me that question. Or actually, no, they didn't ask me if I was preaching angry. They just said, essentially, you have to work through that anger a little bit because it's coming out in your communication and your teaching.
Yep.
So, and I don't want to lose this because to some that just sounds like fiery, biblical, godly conviction, right? To some, right? But then
Yeah,
I think
yeah. People that want to justify that, they go, well, just think of the prophets, man. I'm just a biblical prophet.
so. Before I throw this over to you, Kev, we just had this conversation right before this podcast, but you were reminding me even just of the vision and the mission of Rooted,
Mm-hmm.
right? To see pastors called home into the embrace of the Father, to know for themselves experientially the love of God, because, and it doesn't just stop there, because as local church pastors, a rooted pastor then can shepherd in the rooted church, where
Yes.
congregants with brothers and sisters are experiencing that love. And then from there, you are able to go into a world that is bleeding out, looking for that love, that healing
Yep.
love as well.
That's it.
And and that, to me, it just goes, dang, a lot falls on the leader then. And if I'm
It does.
leading angry and I'm justifying it for whatever reason, if I'm leading angry, if I'm leading out of this deep unaware, this kind of brokenness, that does have ramifications to those around me. So I just wanted to start kind of there, um, and just talk a little bit about anger, and maybe at some point if you want to share your own journey, again,
Mm.
remind us a little bit of that. Maybe some of us are hearing it for the first time. But yeah, so what are some of your initial thoughts now? Just just hearing my little confession and my little
I
share.
don't think I've ever heard that story. And we need to unpack that more. Just you and me over a coffee now that you're living, 3 blocks away. Man, yeah, I did say to you as we were talking about topics that I feel like I'm the expert on anger because where some people might present, I don't know, more with anxiety, or some people might present in certain vulnerable moments more with some kind of addictive behavior around spending money or sexuality or withdrawal or whatever. For me, anger has always been a telltale sign to me that something was awry inside of my psyche, my heart, my spirit, my soul, which, by the way, does not make anger a bad emotion.
Hmm.
In fact, anger is a very necessary emotion. How can I think about, just to use an extreme example, but one we'll all understand, how can I think about 6 million Jews being murdered simply because of who God created them to be in their ethnicity, literally as a part of the chosen people? how can I think about that with not feeling anger? Anger against the powers of darkness, anger against the evil, anger against the perpetrators, even though those perpetrators had their own baggage that led them to that place, they're still responsible for what they did. If we have pastors, talking mostly to a pastoral audience here, not completely, but mostly, if pastors are just these, I don't know, folk that feel like I just have to be gentle and never raise my voice and never show that I'm irritated, I just think that's nonsense. And it's a caricature of Jesus of Nazareth as the guy who's always holding the lamb and never, ever, you know, upsets the tables in the temple. So anger is a necessary emotion. There is stuff to be angry at. But on the other hand, what I did with that in my ministry, I probably have shared this with you before, Kev. I remember when I got really angry back for a period of time in the late 90s when we were trying to move an entire congregation of somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 people, mostly white folks, toward being racially sensitive, racially open, not just from a personal perspective, but from a structural perspective. How can we become anti-racist, pro the justice of the kingdom of God in a city that, is 60, 80% African American? And I can remember using my anger, man. I lived kind of angry. So I kind of preached angry and whatever. And I remember somebody confronting me gently as they confronted you, Kev. And here's what I said. I said, well, Jesus turned over the tables in the temple. And this person said back to me, yeah, he did. Once. And I sat, honestly, that's been 24 years ago, Kev. And that quote still lives within me. There is a place for deep anger against unrighteousness and wound and against those who have perpetrated injustice upon victims, people that couldn't defend themselves, those kinds of things. But we've got to be careful that we don't excuse anger as our primary emotion as being something kingdom when really it can tend to come out of a place of deep wound and often deep shame. One of the other things I would say initially is that from what I have learned, and I've done some work around my anger in therapy, in reading and whatnot, what I've learned over the years is that anger is a secondary emotion. When I am my angriest, usually there's something underneath like fear, sadness, hurt, anxiety that we don't know what to do with. And so it manifests as anger. That's not always the case, but I think some therapists would say it's always a secondary emotion. So the question that I've tried to learn to ask myself over the years when I'm feeling that anger, is this one of those moments that the kingdom is calling me to feel what God feels toward those who have been hurt, toward the powers of darkness that are hurting those that are his kids, his sons and daughters? Or is this one of those moments when I'm afraid of something? Is this one of those moments when I'm deeply sad and the sadness is overwhelming me and I don't know how to respond to it? Or that I have a lot of anxiety that I'm just unaware of and it's coming out like this. That's a place that I'm trying to pay attention to more and more over the years. So there's a couple of initial thoughts for you.
No, that's great. So that's a tool that you acquired more recently or later on. So back in the 90s then, when you were, sounds like you were flipping tables every day.
Pretty much.
Right? Like if you were to somehow go back in time and talk to that Kevin Butcher, right, and knowing what you know now, right, what would you say then? Like, is it as simple as just asking the question that you just asked?
Well, I just got a bit choked up when you asked that question, which is always a sign to me that there's something right now that I need to think about and deal with. Let me just say, I think one of the things that's percolating in me emotionally is there weren't a lot of people there to ask me questions about my anger. There were a couple. I just mentioned one of them. But to connect this with Rooted, this is what we do.
Yeah.
We provide safe space to ask pastors who might be struggling with anger, hey, what's going on? Instead of reacting, what I've found, Kev, especially in Caucasian, more conservative evangelicalism, is that there is no place for anger ever. It's embarrassing, it's threatening. And so what I found to be the case over the years when I would manifest with some kind of anger, I mean, it wasn't like I was punching people in the face or dropping F-bombs all over the place. That's not correct, especially public. I wasn't doing anything. Publicly, I looked pretty cool, although you could feel it sometimes in me. But the reaction I got was just that, a reaction, a pullback, a fear. Maybe I was making people think of some father figure that was abusive, even though I wasn't going to be that guy. They thought their emotions got triggered. So I found that many times churches, instead of having folk who are mature enough to come forward and say, "Hey, Kevin, feeling something from you. You want to have a cup of coffee? What's going on?" The question indicating there's likely something underneath this, and I see you. And I'm not judging you for having a human reaction to something that's in need underneath this anger. In fact, I'm going to love you enough to ask you what's going on, and would you like to talk about it? I think if I was me now, going back, seeing that angry Kevin, I would say, what's going on, son? Because I see something coming out of you right now, and I'm not judging it, but I'm saying it indicates to me that there's some pain, something going on. Do you want to sit and talk about that? Let's see if the Lord will meet us there and maybe expose some kind of wound that is really your anger is your heart's cry for healing of that wound that's underneath that anger. That's what I'd say.
Yeah, just as you're sharing, I'm thinking about all the different best practices and books that I've come across in my life, just how to get more in touch with the inner you and all these different
Yeah.
types of things. But
Yeah.
as good as resources as they are, I was just thinking about, or I was reminded of just the power of presence of you
Dude.
then, right? Because it's not you going back in time and saying, "Hey, I want you to ask yourself this question right now. Is this more about you or is this more about God?" And it's like, and just wrestle through that. No, it's someone who has gone before you,
Yes.
who is secure enough, grounded in the love of God enough to sit just with you, not
Mm-hmm.
try and rush the process of healing, but just open that pathway, open the doorway so you
Yep.
can step into it, explore it,
Open the
see
pathway.
it.
That's it. Mm-hmm.
And it's like, gosh, you can't, there's no one-liner, there's no quick book to read or
No, there's not.
snippet. It's relationship. And it does pain me to hear, that you didn't have that. And I would imagine many pastors don't.
No, which is, in my journey that began to kind of form what rooted might look like. It began, 25, 30 years ago in those lonely moments. And there may have been, if somebody's listening to this podcast saying, "Kevin, I tried to do that with you back in the day, forgive me." Maybe it was too little, too late with where I was at that time of my life. And I did have an amazing therapist who stayed present to my anger. It's one of the reasons why I'm sitting up today and able to do this work is because of her healing. She didn't react to me. She saw me and she was able to come close and say, "Let's talk about it." That presence you're talking about. I think that, I don't know if I'm answering your question here, Kev, but another thing that I've learned over the years about the phrase, for example, of losing your temper. Once I got fired ostensibly over my anger, 23 years ago, when really the larger reason was race. It was really race, but my anger gave the leadership community a reason to fire me. So they fired me. When I went off to get some help, I went for 17 days to a place called the Professional Renewal Center, where there were doctors and lawyers and psychiatrists, not just there to help leaders who had been wounded or had done some wounding. They were the ones there to receive care. It was amazing. And there were a team of other leaders there, of course, to exercise that care. But I remember sitting with a therapist who said, Kev, you don't ever really lose your temper. I said, what? Tell me more about that, because it sure feels to me like I've done that a lot over my life. He says, your body, this kind of goes to that phrase today that comes from a very famous book called The Body Keeps the Score. Your body holds your anger.
Mm.
And so he gave me this workbook that helped me find where my body was holding my anger. And two things came out as I reflected, and this may be helpful to some pastor right now who's struggling with anger. First of all, Kev, this is unbelievable. It came out that I'd been living, I don't know how long, maybe a couple of decades, with my left fist closed, not my right one, which is funny because I'm right-handed. If I was getting ready to punch someone, it'd be with my right hand. I was living with my left fist closed when I was feeling anger. Long before I was saying anything, preaching angrily, acting out in some kind of conversation, the anger was right here in my left fist.
Wow.
And so I began to pay attention to my body and realize the signs were there before I lost it with some kind of a tirade or some kind of bad language or just an intensity that came out of my football self, my football playing self, that would put people off and be kind of offensive. I could recognize I was getting ready to go there, Kev, by paying attention to whether my left fist was closed. And then I could literally say, all right, Lord, what's going on here? And pay attention to what the Spirit might be saying to me and make a choice to relax my fist, relax my heart, and be more present to what was really going on there, not reacting out of my own fearful intensity or whatever. The other thing that I learned in that process was board meetings was a place where my anger as a pastor would, again, I don't want leaders to think that every time we got in the board meeting, I was going to stand up and punch holes in walls. It wasn't like that. It was more of an anger that manifested in an intensity, a defensive intensity. I thought, well, that's just a response to some of the nonsense that these leaders are coming up with within meetings, and some of their words and phrases were somewhat nonsensical, to be honest, in my view. But I noticed that when my normal posture, Kev, was to kind of lean back, sit back in kind of a chill position in those meetings. I just wanted to do the meeting, see what God had to say, and go home to my little girls. When I shifted my posture, sat up, put my arms over the table, and leaned into the middle of that conversation, I realized that was a bodily sign that something was churning in me that was getting ready to come out. So what I learned to do over the years was recognize that. I'm not just sitting up to change posture. I'm sitting up because I'm getting ready to go for it. Then I could say, Lord, what's going on? Like with the fist. And I could choose to surrender the moment, surrender the person that I was getting mad at, lean back in my chair, or I could say, hey guys, I got to take a break. I'll be right back. Go out, walk the hall, say a quick prayer of surrender, come back. The point I'm making is we don't lose our temper. Our body manifests how we're feeling in a relationship with our spouses, in a relationship with our kids, in a relationship with our parishioners, in our relationship with preaching to our parishioners, in meetings in the community, to learn to pay attention to where the anger was starting to arise in my body was a key element to me being able not to not feel it, but to manage it in ways that are redemptive and not hurtful. That was a mouthful I just shared. I hope that's helpful.
No, I think that's very helpful for me. It actually reminds me of, it's like you and I think are wired differently in this way. Whereas I think you're maybe more expressive. Actually, like Becca, my wife, she's more expressive with her emotions and her anger, right? I internalize it.
Yes.
And I remember this conversation I had with her one day because I was frustrated with the way she was expressing her anger.
Yeah.
So I was reactive to kind of you were talking about. Very reactive. Stop cussing, stop yelling, stop being so anxious. It makes me anxious, right? All this stuff. And I think I said to something to the effect of, I never do any of this to you. I never say this to you. I never carry my emotions on my sleeve and make you feel this way. And she just looked at me and she was just like, Kevin, you don't need to say a thing because I
Ooh,
feel it.
dang.
And around that time, we did a couples, like a marriage kind of counseling discipleship thing. And actually one of the pastors was writing about how he would do the same thing. And he like created this image of like, and he's like, I'm the kind of guy where I'm walking down the hallway, and if I'm upset, the flowers would just die as I'm walking by
They would
them. Like,
just
yeah,
shrivel.
yeah. And I was like, oh my gosh, I thought I was hiding it pretty well, or I thought somehow by suppressing it, it just dissipated. And then I actually started reading some studies about how there were higher levels of depression linked to people who internalize their negative emotions.
Dude,
So
that's a
I'm like,
word right there.
talk about body keeps the score.
Yeah.
It's like it's going somewhere. And
Yeah,
just
to
because
your
it's not,
liver, to your stomach, to your heart, to
yep.
your arteries.
So I think to that point, then it's not just about then let me go out and punch some walls like Kevin
Nope.
Hood used to go and punch walls. But I think to your point is like it does require us to intentionally to slow down and start asking those questions. First, recognizing I think I also read that too. Anger being a secondary emotion. It's not
Yeah.
just you're angry. Like taking the time then to go one layer deeper. And I just wanted to add this too while you were talking because I so appreciate like our times together. I'm just like reminded that like all the things that I love about you, Kevin, Mac, Pam, and just so many pastors out there who I just look up to, and it's like I love being like a replicator. Like give me the strategy, tell me the how, and then I just want to like be that, right? Whatever is cool or whatever is good or whatever I want to replicate in the world. I can't replicate this. And I think as pastors, one of the greatest kind of gifts that we can bring to congregations, to those around us, is just who we are. It's not the
Hmm.
nuggets of truth. It's not how you dress. It's not how well you sang or preached even. It's who you are. You can sit with someone and just be transformed by that. I was thinking just
Yes.
recently I was watching, was it I think, yeah, Dallas Willard's memorial service or something, and the way people
Mm.
talked about him was just like he doesn't have to, as smart as he was, like he doesn't have to say anything. Just being with you, you feel that, right? And I go, I want that.
Hmm.
I want that. But to your point, like you can't just like prescribe that. That's work that needs to be done. There's surrendering that needs to go into it.
It
And
is
so
work.
that's where my heart and mind is right now in reaction to all the stuff that you were just sharing.
That's so good, Kev. To your point about presence and your point about I want to be that guy that is just with and people just feel Christ in me, feel who I am not in a weak kind of way, but in the fullness of who Jesus was with all the emotions, but in a kingdom way. I think for those of us who wrestle with anger, which can be an emotion again that is so shamed.
Hmm.
Do we get shamed for disinterest? I don't know. Maybe we do, but I don't think much. Do we get shamed for fill in the blank with another emotion that might not be so positive at a certain point in time? I think anger is an emotion that invites shame a lot of the time. People shaming us. I think one of the beginning points of healing is to realize that first to own that we have an issue with our anger. Something's cooking inside of us, and it's not just positive. Sometimes it's wound, it's sadness, it's fear, it's something that is calling out for healing. But then, in terms of Jesus being present to us, what is He? I used to feel so ashamed when I had a moment of anger, like Jesus was just sitting over in the corner, shaking his head, going, "One more time, bro? Really?
Hmm.
I mean, how much rope do I give you here, bro? In your marriage, how many walls are you going to put holes in this little mobile home, or how many things you're going to throw? I mean, people listening to this podcast are going to say, man, this guy's a maniac. I'm probably making it worse than it really was. If it was as bad as I'm kind of acting like it was, my wife would never have stayed with me. And it did come to a point where at one point she almost didn't. And then I began to get some help. But Jesus, when we're feeling these feelings, even after we've acted out, is not shaming us any more than he shamed Peter. He told Peter to put his sword down, but it didn't say, you piece of you know what, Peter. How are you ever going to fit in my kingdom? He just said, put the sword down, son. He was present. He's present to us in our anger. And he invites us to take whatever that is, to begin to take whatever that is that's pushing on that part of us that feels like the only way we can control what we're feeling is to rage or to talk or to explode or whatever. He's saying, come unto me, all you angry sons and daughters, laboring under the intensity of that anger you don't know what to do with. And lay your head on my breast, and I will give you rest. For all the angry folks out there, or folks that sometimes get angry and wonder where it comes from, he is not shaming us. He's not saying, you better get your act together, or here are the 10 things I want you to discipline yourself to do or not do. There are some things that we can learn to discipline ourselves to do. But his first approach to us is, I see you. I know there's pain underneath this anger. I care for you in that pain. I've come to heal that pain. And I want you to take a step toward me, which is to take a step toward home and freedom. I will give you rest. I think that's crucial because so many of us do walk around with shame. There's two things that happens with anger. First, we deny it. No, I'm good. Like, Kev, you were tempted to do. You're like, no, I'm not preaching angry. And I did that same thing for years. The second thing is, once we realize, yeah, we're angry, shame. Just shame. Look at me. I did it again. What a piece of crap I am. I remember a key moment where a man was Jesus to me that shifted my viewpoint of my anger. Honestly, it wasn't long before I got fired, but it was the beginning of some of my healing. I went to this men's retreat. I wasn't speaking. I was a participant. And I loved this guy, this therapist. I forget his name. Met with him 6 a.m. one morning. Before, I think it was our last morning. It was the only opening he had. Walked into his room, sat down, told him my anger story, told him about when I was a kid, my precious dad didn't know what to do with my anger. He just kept saying, don't lose your temper. I don't lose my temper. Why do you lose your temper? Which to an 8-year-old, by the way, dads and moms, not helpful. That kid is feeling some stuff and needs someone to come close and say, what's going on? Like I wanted to do to my younger self back at that church. And he said to me, when I told him my story, I said, I've just been an angry man. He said, Kevin, let me stop you. I want you to hear this from me. He said, you're not an angry man. You're not an angry man. You're a man who sometimes gets angry. Changed my world. That was around the year 2000. A deeper part of my healing began. It was too late for that church. I had already kind of sealed my fate. And the racism had helped seal my fate. But that began a different place for me, Kev, because instead of now saying, remember, shame is about who we are. Guilt is about what we do. Instead of owning, gosh, I lost it there. That's something I did. I would internalize that and say, I'm just an angry piece of whatever. So for those who are wrestling with anger that listening to this podcast, you are not an angry woman. You are not an angry man. You are not an angry daughter. You are not an angry son. You're a daughter who sometimes gets angry. You're a son who sometimes gets angry. And yes, you want to learn to handle that. But the first invitation is from a Jesus who says, come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Changes everything, Kev.
Like the next step, what would you say then from here? So someone's listening right now. They're trying to receive that.
Yes.
And they don't even know how to ask those other secondary questions. Like, okay, I feel anger. I do get angry sometimes, but they don't even know where to go next. What would you say?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is if you've come to the point where you're saying, you know what, my anger, which again is not it's not a bad emotion. We need to be angry, but my anger, I can start to feel. If we've come to the point, Kevin, where our listeners are saying, something's going on in me. Maybe it's from my childhood. Maybe it's from the job I just got fired from. Maybe it's, who knows, something in my head that I can't reconcile with real life or whatever. But my anger has become, it's a problem. I have to listen to what my spouse has been saying. I have to listen to what my church has been indicating. If we've come to that point, the first thing that occurs to me, Kev, is look at the face of Jesus or go to the Gospels and see if you can begin to see his love toward you. I mean, honestly, oh man, because I didn't have a lot of people doing that with me, I wish I could jump through this, podcast line and have coffee with folks who are wrestling with the loneliness of that anger and just sit with them and embody Jesus and say, I'm here. I've got you. You're going to find your way home. You're not an angry person. You're a person who sometimes gets angry. For them to be able to turn toward Jesus and to begin to see the Father through the face of Jesus running toward them, not running away from them in the far country of their anger, running toward them with arms open, ready to say, you're my son, you're my daughter. Let's start to do this work together. Just take a step toward home. That's first. And then secondly, because sometimes that can be hard. That can be hard because we've looked at God as being a shaming being around our anger for so long. Secondly, and maybe firstly, find a safe person that you can sit with and begin to just pour this out. Where you think this comes from? What began this point? How long have you been feeling angry? How have you been justifying it? What does it cost you? It's kind of like sitting with somebody who can begin to hear your lament around anger. I don't think this work is easily done alone. I couldn't have done it without my therapist that I think God sent literally specifically to me. I would say, don't heal alone. And for pastors out there, Kev, here's the invitation. This is what we do. We will not treat you like a commodity. We will embrace you like a brother or like a sister. We're all pastors. We do this work. We are you. Some of you might want to schedule something with me because at least you'll be talking to a fellow person that's wrestled with anger. Kevin Hu, one of our colleagues here, has also confessed his own wrestling match with anger, although he manifests differently than I do. We are here for you. But if you don't want to go that route, find someone, a therapist, a friend, who will sit with you and begin to be present to you as you begin to pour out what you've been holding on to for so very long. That's the first two movements, I would call them, invitations toward relationship, Jesus and someone else, that will help us begin to find our way home.
I was looking back at the Barna studies. I think it was from a year or two ago about pastors and the many pastors feeling burnt out, stepping down, whatever it is. And number one was just the overall stresses of the job, especially through the pandemic. But the close number two was isolation.
Oh boy.
It was just loneliness and isolation. And when I hear you kind of share the next steps as we lead kind of people in there, it's all about relationships.
Indeed.
Relationships with our Father, and then having that safe relationship with someone that has gone before us, that we trust, that is safe.
Indeed.
I don't want to overuse that phrase, but I mean that is the word. Someone who sees you for you, is not out to criticize or judge you or critique you or just sit there and tell you what to do, but to listen and to hold that space for you. I think that is invaluable, and that's what I've received through Rooted as well.
I'm so glad,
and what
Kev.
I want to continue to provide for others. So, I think we've come to the end, Kev. Is there anything else you want to share?
Well, I was just thinking, we kind of started talking about preaching out of anger.
Yeah.
And I just maybe will leave this one final anecdote with pastors who are listening. This could be true for anybody who has to share anything in a public way, even like when we're sharing with our kids about something, but we will give away what we're receiving. What we're receiving the morning we step up to preach or in that Bible study, or even when we're disciplining our children who might need to be disciplined, we will be giving them, parishioners, kids, spouses, whatever, in that moment what we are receiving. We give away what we're receiving. So for me, a touchstone over the last maybe 15 years, after the firing for sure, as I get ready to preach, I have to get to my compassionate tears for myself. I have to feel my compassionate, loving God speaking to my wounded healer son's heart from the text. Like that moment where I go, oh my gosh, Lord, this is so for me. This is so for me. And sometimes there's tears, sometimes not, but there's a moment when I'm going, my compassionate, loving God sees me, and I'm right here in this text. And then secondly, sometime during my study, I am asking the Lord to help me get to my tears, my compassionate tears for the people that are coming in to hear me speak. For my children that need me to give them a word of discipline. For my spouse, we're going to have a hard conversation. To feel from the Lord what his heart is for those human beings that I'm in connection with, speaking to or whatever. Because if I don't get to those tears of compassion and presence, then I'm going to give them whatever else I have, Kev, which is often anger at the world, defensiveness about something, fear about what I'm feeling. If I don't get to that compassion and love of God for me, and then his compassion and love for others, I'm going to give them something else, which for angry folks, it'll come out as anger. And we'll say, yeah, but Jeremiah said, no, stop it. You weren't there when Jeremiah said anything. And you're not Jeremiah, by the way. You're not Jeremiah. You're you, son or daughter of God. Pay attention, I would say to my brothers and sisters, the clergy, to what you're paying attention to inside your heart. Hear the voice of God for you and for others. Then what comes out of you will be his love. Even if it's spoken in a direct way, it'll be his love, not our stuff and our baggage. Yeah, that's it.
Amen. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us on the podcast. To the
Love
rest
you,
of
Kev.
y'all, I love you too, Kev. To all the rest of y'all, thank you so much for joining us for this episode. And until next time, blessings to you all.